Welcome back to the fourth session of Mark's Gospel, study of Mark's Gospel. I'm Pastor Doug Bronner, one of the pastors at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and I am so happy to have you with me again. Or if it's your first time with us, fantastic. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be looking at more verses than normal, so we're going to kind of go at breakneck speed to try to get this in 10 minutes. We're going to look at verses 21 through 34, which hopefully you have read before you watch this video and answered the questions from your student guide. If you're wondering where that student guide is, go to holycrosscs.org and /grow, and if you scroll down the page, you will see a link for Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 34, and that's your study guide, and it's a PDF that you can download and work on. Anyway, so last week, Jesus called 4 disciples, Peter and Andrew, James and John, 2 sets of brothers, and he gave them a promise that they would be fishers of men. And they would do that by following him. So he invites them into the kingdom. Remember earlier in chapter 1, Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven is here. The reign of God is here. And so the 4 disciples are invited to be participants in that reign of God, as you and I are as well. And from there we move on into Capernaum. Jesus, walking along the shore, along with his 4 disciples, comes into Capernaum. Now, it's probably good to put a semicolon after Capernaum, because what happens here is there's a break between their coming into Capernaum and also then entering into the synagogue. It wasn't the same day. It was close to it, but probably not the same day. So Jesus, on the Sabbath, enters the synagogue in Capernaum. And let's talk about the Sabbath real quickly. The Sabbath began at Friday with sundown and ended Saturday with sundown. And on Friday night there would be worship. Probably Saturday morning there'd be worship of sorts in the synagogue. And following the worship on Friday night, there would be a Sabbath meal that they would join in on. A synagogue could be formed with 10 men. In the city where there were 10 Jewish men, a synagogue could be formed. And there was a teaching that went on in the synagogue. And the one thing we noticed right away, as we take the 10,000-foot view of what Jesus is doing here, and he would do this often in the synagogues, is that he would teach with authority. The people recognized that he taught with authority, not like the scribes. And the scribes were the lawyers of the people. They were the experts in the law. And the law there meaning Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We call that the Torah. And they would have been experts in that. And what the scribes would do in their teaching is they would gather a lot of other sayings from different rabbis to back their point, and they would quote different rabbis and so forth to make the point that they wanted to make. Jesus' teaching must have been more along the line of the prophetic voice, which said, "Thus says the Lord," not quoting a bunch of different rabbis. And so the people were amazed at his teaching. Well, on this occasion, whether it happened, whether this man was in the synagogue already or he happened to come into the synagogue, a demonic entered the synagogue, right? And demonic is there. And the demonic right away says to Jesus, "What to me and to you?" That's a literal translation of what he says. It's a Hebrew idiom that simply means this: why are you interfering with us? And he knows what he's come to do, right? He says it in the form of a question, "Have you come to destroy us?" But really it could be taken as a statement, "You have come to destroy us." And the demonic also acknowledges the person of Jesus, his humanity, he calls him Jesus of Nazareth, and his divinity, the Holy One of God. That term Holy One of God is only used by the demonic here, and then also Luke's account of the same story, but then it's only used one other time, and that's by Peter when he calls Jesus the Holy One of God. So we don't know if it was a phrase that was often used of the Messiah or not. It might have been, or a less used phrase, but it's kind of a curious thing. Well, then what does Jesus do next? Jesus tells the demon to be muzzled. We would probably say shut up, but there's a little bit more to that. You'll find the same word being used in 1 Corinthians 9:9 concerning muzzling an ox. And be muzzled and come out of him. So why does Jesus tell him first to be quiet, to be muzzled? Well, he knows who he is. And we're going to run into this again. You've already read it later in the story where Jesus would not permit the demons to say who he was. And that's important for you and I to grasp. You see, we're not to know who Jesus is. If we're following on this journey with Jesus, remember that's the title of our study. If we're journeying with Jesus, we are beginning to see who he is along that journey until we get to the cross and the empty tomb. And then it'll be revealed to us that truly he is the Son of God. And Jesus doesn't want the journeyers with him to know who he is and what he's come to do at this time. So he tells them to be quiet. And then the demon seizes the man. This is more than an epileptic seizure. He cries out. He screams a gut-wrenching scream. And as he comes out, the demon comes out. And the people are flabbergasted. They're absolutely astonished at what Jesus has done. But did you notice the question they ask? They don't say, who is this? They say, what is this? And they're caught up in what has taken place in the synagogue, what Jesus has taught, and what he has done in casting out the demon out of this man. It's interesting. They're disputing among themselves. They're dialoguing among themselves. They're discussing. They're debating among each other. What is this that we've just experienced here? Well, after that, then, Mark uses his typical way of saying things. He uses a hyperbole, and he says that his report went out everywhere into all the surrounding area of Galilee. And Mark is a great storyteller. Tells us the story of Jesus, and he grabs our attention by this. Wow, it goes out, and we can imagine it would. Well, following the synagogue worship, after all that happened there, Peter and Andrew, James and John probably invite Jesus to join them in the Sabbath meal. And so they head to Peter's home, which was probably pretty close to the synagogue. And I have a note to an interesting article in archaeology, biblical archaeology, that's in your student notes. You might want to check that out about Peter's house. And as they enter, they're told right away, Jesus is told right away that Peter's mother-in-law is sick with a fever. And Luke tells the story a little differently than Mark does. Luke will tell us that he hovered over her and he commanded the demon. He rebuked the demon, or the fever, excuse me. He rebuked the fever. Mark doesn't give us any of that. Mark simply tells us he raised her. And how did he raise her? By seizing her hand, by grasping her hand and pulling her up, and the fever leaves her. How completely was she healed? Well, she went on serving them throughout the rest of the Sabbath meal. It gives you the impression, and meant to give us the impression, that she is completely restored. Well, from that then, the news of what happened in the synagogue and what happens in Peter's home, the people of Capernaum, as soon as the Sabbath is over, so now Saturday at sundown, they bring all of their sick and all their demon-possessed to Jesus to have him heal him. And he heals both those who are sick and those who are demon-possessed. Now, he lumps them together, but they're still to be separate, and acknowledging that there is this demonic world. So let's have three takeaways here that I'll have you deal with a little bit later in your study too. The first takeaway is this. Jesus has the authority to direct our lives by his teaching. Jesus has the authority to direct our lives by his teaching. The reign of God has burst into our life like it had Peter and Andrew, James, and John. And we may not like it at times, but he still has the authority to direct our lives where he sees it needs to go. And we follow his commands, not our ways. And he still teaches with authority through the scriptures. Even the words of Paul are still the words of Jesus. And they're taught to us. And God has his authority in our lives. Second takeaway, Jesus has authority to deal with our illnesses. That he hasn't changed any, whether it's through medicine or it's directly. Jesus is still the healer of our bodies physically, of our minds, of our emotions. He's the healer of our person, and he chooses to heal, and he calls us to believe that. Even though it's hard for us to understand, he calls for us to believe that he's that healer. And then thirdly, Jesus has authority to deal with the demonic forces. Now I'm having you dig deeper into that in your study guide later. You can look at some passages from Ephesians chapter 6 that you need to dig into, because we in our society have limited what's real to only what we can see, touch, taste, what we can sense, right? but the Bible reminds us that there's more behind what we see, and that our battle is not against other people. Our battle is against the demonic forces. Okay, so that's it for today. I encourage you now to go to your study guide and finish the questions. And a reminder that the first Tuesday of every month there is a Zoom meeting that you can ask questions of me. I'll have more information of that coming out soon, but just put that in the back of your brain. The first Tuesday of the month is the Tuesday when we'll be dealing with some questions about Mark's Gospel. God's blessings on your study.